to the panel of financial environment and environmental data analytics. But first, we would like to thank the School of Law and in particular Mario for organizing this interesting and important forum. And so today we have three panelists. On my left is Dan Krekelberg. Dan Krekelberg is Policy Director of the Climate Registry. And on my right, we have Mike Sukop. She's a professor at FIU, Department of Earth and Environment. And to my extreme right, we have Enrique Villamor, which is professor at Florida International University, also Department of Mathematics. I will be the moderator. My name is Pablo Olivares. I'm from Toronto Metropolitan University in Canada. So I will ask the panelists to take 10 minutes for the presentations, and then we'll have a Q&A moment after the three talks. So Mike, you can start.
Thank you. And feel free to sit there.
Thank you. So, is this one on? I think it is. You can hear me well enough. Thank you for letting me be first. It's an honor to be first and be here again this year. And I'm going to be talking principally about environmental data. I'm a physical scientist primarily, so I'm not. I'm kind of new to the whole financial side of things and just learning basically as we go here developing this program. I'm going to talk about environmental data and environmental finance, but it's principally going to be about environmental data. So in terms of motivation, this is a little inconvenient in terms of seeing the screen myself, but so we're interested in incorporating environmental data and models into financial products and decisions, and we're interested in leveraging investment capital for environmental advancement and returns for investors. And that's pretty much universal as far as I understand the field. We're embarking on this effort to cross-train students in finance, environmental data, and quantitative risk analysis. And I have a class coming up in the fall that will be the first one to try to help contribute to that. Enrique is already teaching one this semester. So I think what I'm talking about, at least my philosophy about this, is not really traditional ESG kind of carbon accounting that is being done in so many places by so many corporations and so forth, but rather kind of environmental data and novel products. And when I say novel, this is maybe things that are actually very familiar to a lot of you, but less so to me. So, this is the place I'm at basically. And that's what the whole new exclamation point thing is about here too. It's kind of principally new to me. And so we're learning as we go. We have great interest in it, but just getting started and understanding it's very nascent. So as you can imagine, there's a large variety of environmental data types and sources out there. And what I'm going to even focus on a little bit today is including model results as sort of data. Traditionally, a physical scientist may not think of model results as being data. And Hugh has already told me he's going to touch on issues with modeling data or results later. But I'm going to look at that here today, particularly in terms of flooding and some of the new things that are happening. So as we were preparing for this talk, we kind of came across this Microsoft planetary computer database, and it's really got, they say here, petabytes of data, and I'm going to give you a little flavor of what some of that looks like here. But it's kind of an amazing resource, and this is, it's been an explosion basically. Compared to when I was a graduate student, the amounts of data, the ability to get it readily are just overwhelming to some degree. So this is the data catalog. They have a data catalog, and I'll show you that a little bit more. There's these application programming interfaces that allow people to get it quite readily, and then there are hubs and applications that people are working on. And I just have listed here some of the key subheadings: air quality, biodiversity, biomass, climate, weather, digital elevation models, and infrastructure, many other things, solar, irradiation, and so forth. So under each of these, you'll find tens of separate databases that are quite easy to get to with Python or R scripts and so forth. And this is principally the way we're going. And, it's not, I know a lot of this may not be new to the quants in the finance and business, but we're kind of picking up on the other side here. So other types of data, the USGS has huge repositories of data for water in particular, and that's my specialty. And then, interestingly, we're talking about extracting data from models. There's also kind of a new thing, which is a kind of a meta-assembly of models that have been done by all the South-Florida water management districts and the Department of Environmental Protection. So this is something that's kind of novel and doesn't appear in many other places, and something that could be leveraged in these types of endeavors, linking in financial needs. So many times, especially in terms of flooding, we begin with some kind of an object map here where we're looking at different buildings, for instance, and perhaps their economic productivity, and then looking at potential damages that could occur to those buildings, and then linking it with some sort of water depth map, for example, in the context of flooding, and then coming up with the damage functions, and then proceeding to a damage map. So this is kind of the basic way that this is done, and you're probably not familiar with this. So in terms of flood modeling, there's been a recognition that we have a need for higher resolution flood modeling, but at the same time, we have a need for being able to conduct many more realizations of these flood models in order to address the probabilistic risk aspects of it. So new things are coming out. I'm working with the South Florida Water Management District, and we're actually looking at these two models right now for their adaptation planning in the future. So one is called Primo, and that's out of UC Irvine, and the other one is called Sphinx, and that's out of Dept in the Netherlands. And if you don't know, they're kind of a quasi-governmental but consulting firm at the same time that's charged with protecting the Netherlands from flooding, basically. So the big things that are happening here is these models have to be very fast in order to do the repetitive calculations for the probabilistic risk assessment and uncertainty, dealing with the uncertainty. And they also are dealing with compound flooding, which is something that maybe a lot of models in the past haven't done as well. So we have to look at what's happening with the sea as it's coming up, due to storm surge and so forth, and then rain. And then in our case down here, groundwater levels, and then also so we call it alluvial versus fluvial flooding, from rain that doesn't get absorbed right where it is, or what comes down the rivers and causes flooding. So and something else that's happening at the same time is there's so much remote sensing data available. These models are able to collect the data they need to operate from these remotely sensed databases and so forth. And what this means is instead of relying on engineering drawings, perhaps, of what a canal is supposed to look like, they can actually capture its actual geometry, and they can also tell, for instance, if it's clogged with sediment, or if it's got a lot of vegetation growing into it, cause it to not perform at the level it might be expected to otherwise. And this is causing huge differences between what FEMA comes up with for flood challenges in different places and what these newer models are coming up with. And I'm going to show you one of this right here. So this is a very recent paper for flooding in LA that looks at 3 different types of flooding. On the right-hand side, you can see the fluvial hazard on the upper side, and one that FEMA doesn't even really consider. They look at the coastal and the fluvial. So, there's a lot of, and I can't quite point to these, but there's a lot of people affected. You can see in terms of fluvial, well, in terms of different depths here, there are a lot of people affected that wouldn't be captured otherwise if there was no fluvial part included. And you can see the 1% annual chance is the normal FEMA mapping of flood risk. so it's much lower than what these more modern models are coming up with. And this is the type of data that's available. And similarly, by doing all these different runs and incorporating some uncertainty, you can actually map the difference of the percentiles of the 1% annual flood zone. You can see that the bands get pretty big here, and the areas that need to be included can be quite large compared to what they might be otherwise. And then turning to the Deltata's model here, Sphinx. It stands for Superfast Inundation of Coasts. This is just something from Jacksonville, Florida, not too far east of us here. But there's actual data shown as points here. They're a little bit hard to see, and I can't point them out right now, but they match pretty well with the results of the model. And this is actually a Sphinx model, but they have used also this Dept 3D model, which is kind of the flagship model, and it was done in a lot more detail, but it takes a lot longer to run, so it isn't really possible to use it as routinely as we might like to. And it's not possible to do the multiple runs that would be needed to do the probabilistic assessment. And then this goes back a little while, I guess 2018, Rand came to town for a while and did some vulnerability assessments. And these are asset-dominated vulnerabilities in Broward County, looking at particular types of conditions, average precipitation, and kind of a mid-2040 sea level rise future. So you can see that the asset values change considerably under those conditions as time goes on. And one more local one at the bottom of this map here is Miami International Airport. So you can see it's basically our region right here, and that's the C7 basin. And the sub-basin is the one that's shown in more color, and it's subject to flooding along the canal there. So an analysis was done here using similar kinds of repetitive modeling. And so we can calculate the total damages in terms of exceedance probabilities and use these for trying to assess the financial risk, basically. So in conclusion, you have a lot of different types of relevant flood data types and sources, of, not just flood data, but all different types of data types and sources, including model results. Flood modeling is advancing, resolution and speed to use probabilistic risk assessment. And there's a lot of potential out there for bringing this type of data to the work that we're trying to do in this program and that the rest of you are trying to do in practice. So thank you.
Thanks very much. Our second speaker, please.
Hi there. This is on. Dan Krekelberg, Policy Director with the Climate Registry. Want to thank Florida International University for inviting me here. It's an honor to be here. And I look forward to presenting on this topic of financial engineering and environmental data analytics. I'm going to be focusing on the data analytics part, looking at greenhouse gas emissions accounting. That's the work that the Climate Registry is involved with. And I'll provide a little background on the Climate Registry, get into some of the policies that are being proposed to mandate greenhouse gas accounting, explain how some of the requirements of that and how that data can be used for decision making, financial, or even looking at mitigation pathways to address climate change. Okay, so quick background on the Climate Registry. We're a nonprofit based in Los Angeles. It started in 2007, so pretty early to the game in terms of this type of greenhouse gas accounting work. We specialize in the measurement, reporting, and verification of greenhouse gas emissions, MRV approach. We operate a database, well, we have a few databases, Carbon Footprint Registry, and a Water Energy Nexus registry. These track emissions from the footprint of public and private entities. And for the water one in particular, looking at energy and water use for utilities. And we provide trainings, advisory, consulting, and publications. Our founding dates back to 2000, actually, with the law that came forward from the California State Legislature, looking to track emissions from energy efficiency programs that were operating in the state in anticipation of a cap and trade program that's now in place. So looking to quantify the greenhouse gas reduction benefits of those energy improvements. Since then, we've expanded beyond California. We're now operational throughout North America, and we're advised by a council of jurisdictions throughout the US, Canada, and Mexico on how to do that type of work. So part of our publications are protocols. This is the work that I'm involved with, is keeping these protocols up to date. I've got them listed here. The two key ones that apply to our registry reporting are the general reporting protocol and the general verification protocol. And then we have some more sector-specific protocols as well. These lay out the process for taking in data, different types of metrics in terms of energy consumption, water, waste, and translating that into greenhouse gas emissions, which are then reviewed by third party and reported through our registry program. We also provide guidance to sector-specific organizations looking at small business, renewable energy, and for transit agencies, so basically instructing how different organizations can go about tracking their emissions. And most recently launched a net zero disclosure platform, net zero portal, it's called. It just came out in January. And it's designed to track the commitments of organizations to carbon neutrality and net zero, to go into the details of what those targets look like. And this is very timely to have this launch. A lot of organizations have put out these net zero commitments, and it's trying to get down into the details of those. And there's also been a lot of regulatory bodies that have provided recommendations on what their net zero targets should look like. UN report came out recently at COP, that their Integrity Matters report that provides recommendations on net zero. The FTC has proposed a rule to revise, or they're proposing to revise their green guides to look at how net zero targets are being communicated. ISO's developed guidelines for net zero and science-based targets. There are some initiatives to align net zero targets with the science basis for 1.5 degree pathway. So I'll get into the policies I was mentioning. There's often kind of looking at the policies and saying, well, this is kind of ESG, but I see it distinct from ESG. It is emissions are something that are considered within the ESG, but even independent of ESG, GHG emissions accounting has existed before that that acronym came up, and depending on whatever direction ESG goes, there will still be GHG emissions accounting that's happening. So I think just wanted to make that distinction. There's another panel, I believe, as well as part of this on specifically on ESG, so I won't go on into too much on that. But greenhouse gas reporting has historically been voluntary. It's now, there's proposals to make it mandatory now. We're seeing that in a few different places. So the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, has proposed a rule for climate disclosures for investors specifically. So looking for publicly traded companies to disclose their emissions. There's a rule that federal contractors in the US would be required to report their emissions to be eligible for federal contracts. And that's, all federal agencies, DOD, GSA. If you want to do business with the federal government, they're saying you need to be transparent about the emissions that are generated. And then in California, we've got some bills, Climate Corporate Data Accountability Act, SB 253, it's in the legislature now, and SB 261, looking at the climate-related financial risks. I also saw there's some people from Utah in the audience. There's a carbon tax that is a ballot measure that's going forward. They're collecting signatures to put it on the ballot for November, so something to keep an eye out there. Okay, so I'll talk about some of the features of these mandatory reporting policies. So they typically tie back to some type of standards or guidance documents. Two prominent ones are the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and the TCFD, Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosures. They also look at 3 scopes of emissions. So typically, reporting will be scope 1, which is looking within the footprint of an organization or what they have operational control over. Scope 2 is indirect emissions from energy procurement, and scope 3 is indirect emissions from the value chain, so the supply chain. Scope 3 has been, this one is contentious because it requires looking, at suppliers, first and second tier suppliers, and getting data from them, or making some assumptions about what those operations look like and the emissions associated with them. And well, I'm going to get into this a little bit more in another slide, but there's also a proposal with the federal contracting rules specifically to require science-based net zero targets for major federal suppliers. That's a big deal. They will have to hit a target, net zero target by a certain date, not too far off, and demonstrate progress toward that. And verification, it's an important piece of all of this. It's making sure that the data that's being disclosed is quality. It's something that the Climate Registry is really committed to. We have a protocol on verification. It's included in some of the proposed rules and not in others. And there's not a lot of clear direction on the levels of assurance or what standards would be used as part of that verification. So it's something to keep an eye on in terms of the quality of the data. I'll just say that, we're talking data here, and all of this, these rules that I'm mentioning, they will create a lot of data. They will really provide a lot of resources that can be used to analyze emissions and tie that to other analysis like cost-benefit analysis, looking at prioritization of mitigation pathways. So it's going to be a lot of good information coming out of this. Scope 3, boy, I wish I had time to get really into this. I got the slide up there.
I think there's going to be a question about it.
Yeah. So the slide's there. It's challenging. We'll talk about it a little bit more. I want to be respectful of time here. So, there's different ways to measure it, different data sources that can be used, primary and secondary. And software is being designed to kind of model those scope 3 emissions. But verification is a challenge with some of those models. So I want to put that out there. Another area of GHG accounting that's becoming increasingly important is the land sector, and taking inventory of land and how much carbon dioxide is being sequestered from that land, or could be if different crops are planted, soil amendments, all different types of interventions. And this is important for the mitigation side, meeting those net zero targets. So you can do so many reductions, but looking to the land sector to provide those nature-based solutions for reducing carbon. And as I've said, all of this can be used for mitigation planning, laying out that pathway, setting a baseline. There's percentage reduction targets that are tied back to that baseline. Looking at different scenarios, so kind of forecasting what those emissions could look like, how different policies, regulations could come in to help reduce those, and what responsibility ultimately goes back to the reporting entity. And the data can be disaggregated in different ways, looking at sector-specific or operating units, and there can be visualization to show in graphs and charts what that looks like. And then also performing cost-benefit analysis to prioritize measures, budget for them, and integrate them into management plans. So that's the end of my presentation. We'll get into any questions, and I'll be here all day, so happy to chat with anyone one-on-one. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So our next speaker, Enrique Villamor.
Okay, so I would like to first thank Mario and the other organizers for putting together this environment forum, the College of Law for hosting it. And what I'm going to present here is, what we are doing in the program that Mario is directing, the Environmental Finance and Risk Management Program, right? What we are doing is trying to manage the climate risk, right, brought upon climate change or any kind of climate risk. And the way we are going to do that is by integrating the environment with the finance, and the connecting tool is going to be mathematics and data science, right? So the environmental scientists are going to provide us with the data, right? Data that, as the one that Mike and Dan have been talking about. And then the powerful tool of mathematics and data science, artificial intelligence, machine learning is going to give us a mathematical model for that. And then we put it together with the finance in order to create financial instruments to help us manage any kind of climate risk. So here we say, Miami Mayor Francis Suarez stated recently that we have $200 billion worth of property exposed to climate change here in Miami, or in South Florida. And he notes that the magnitude of our climate emergency dwarfs the money that we can raise locally, right? So we have a big problem here, especially in South Florida, right? In many other places, as we see it every time we turn on the news, right? What's happening now in California, right? So now, there are special types of financial instruments, such as, and here I'm giving you by no means an exhaustive list of those financial instruments, whether derivatives, parametric index insurance, green and catastrophe bonds, whose cash flows are specifically linked to weather, resilience, adaptation, emission reduction, mitigation, restoration, social and environmental impact projects, or geological parameters, right? So those are the instruments, some of the instruments, financial instruments that we can design and price using the theory that in our program, right? Investors, or someone has to buy those instruments, right? So investors might have previously felt little need to include environmental analysis as part of their typical due diligence, right? Now that that situation might be changing because natural hazards clauses that expressly defer repayment after a disaster have begun to appear in sovereign bond issues, such as catastrophe bonds, right? So it means that investors have to know a little bit about the environmental sciences, because usually the payments of those catastrophe bonds, for instance, are being triggered by natural disasters. So you need to know how to evaluate that data, or and determine when those payments are going to be triggered. So therefore, knowledge of the environmental sciences will help the investor evaluate this contingency, right? So that's why we need to integrate the finance and the environment. Universities have traditionally kept expertise in environmental sciences and finance in separate silos. In fact, one 2017 review of climate finance literature stated the next generations of finance practitioners may be underprepared to tackle climate change related issues. So that's one of the motivations why we thought about this program, right? Integrating the two things, the environment and the finance. So it has been up to private companies to pioneer the merging of finance, insurance, and environmental sciences by developing innovations such as hurricane and earthquake catastrophe bonds, in which investors take on the risk of paying for hazard damage in exchange for the bond's interest payments and its portfolio diversification qualities, right? So here, I mean, basically one of those catastrophe bonds is a bond that you buy, and if a catastrophe event happens, the buyer doesn't get the principal back or only a portion of that principal. If it doesn't happen, that's when they get a big return on their investment, right? And we will talk a little bit about those later. Sustainable finance consists of more than just knowing how to provide financing or green projects. So this is, again, going towards the philosophy that we need to merge those two things, the natural systems, right, and the human systems. And this is what our program is about. If averting dire environmental consequences is the purpose of this cross-disciplinary effort, then it is going to need unbiased guidance, academic rigor, and deep cooperation between scientists from multiple environmental disciplines, as well as from private finance. So that's why our program, the Environmental Finance and Risk Management Program, uses mathematics and the data science, as I said before, to connect the two, the environmental sciences to the finance, to introduce innovative environment-linked markets and methods such as, and here again I give you a list, hurricane, flood, earthquake, catastrophe bonds. I mean, those are reinsurance objects, right? That they would be, for instance, insurance companies will buy in the event of a catastrophe happen, for instance, a hurricane in Florida, so that if they have a lot of losses or claims, this extra bond that they bought from a reinsurance is going to give them that money that might not be covered. They might not be able to cover with whatever they have because they have lots of claims. So those are those catastrophe bonds. Whether derivatives, similar to the financial derivatives such as calls and puts, but rather than the underlying being a stock, which is stochastic in nature, is a weather event, a weather rain, temperature. Right? I mean, and then you can use that to manage climate risking, because about 35% of the businesses in the US are exposed to some kind of climate risk. Carbon markets, emission trading systems, right? I mean, it goes back to what Dan was talking about. I mean, we need to monitor carbon emissions and design emission trading systems to reduce those emissions, right? Cap and trade, taxing, something like that. And then mathematics and data science is the right tool to manage those things. Parametric index insurance, number 4, is another object that you can use similar to a catastrophe bond, but rather than the trigger being the losses in the event of catastrophe, the trigger is the, for instance, in the case of a hurricane, it would be that the winds have sustained velocities or speeds above a threshold for a given time, right? So once you have that data, then we can design this parametric index insurance. Real option analysis to evaluate environmental projects. ESG portfolios, adding an ESG component to the portfolios, to the market portfolios. any kind of green bonds, and we're gonna talk about one example later. And finally, a debt for nature swap, right? I mean, you go to, you're interested in a country to conserve or their, nature, and then you go and tell them, I mean, we are gonna forgive you your debt in exchange for you to keep the nature in your country. So and then you need to quantify one versus the other, so that it's a equitable swap, right? So those are some of the instruments, and what we are trying to do here is to train these financial engineers using mathematics to value these securities, to construct investment portfolios and manage risk. And that our program adds an environmental component to those skills to produce the graduates who will be the first, what we call the green quants, right? Rather than the green quant versus financial quant. This blending of disciplines requires a change of mindset about the academic boundaries that separate environmental sciences and finance right now. We're trying to merge those things. Green quants with an integrated training in how the world works, the financial system, and how the planet works, the natural system, will be needed to help manage climate risk. So now I'm gonna go quick because now if we go into the mathematics, I don't want to bore you with this, but basically I'm gonna give you an example of how to price one of those financial instruments, right? To help, and this is the so-called sustainability bonds. And here we're going to present a model for this pricing these bonds, improving on some work by Stephanie Melnick and Erlandson from the Anthropocene Fixed Income Institute, a discussion paper by those two authors, right? So, what is a sustainability linked bond? It's a bond that is going to pay an extra coupon, if you do not fulfill the sustainability goal that you are going to, that you want to. So that could be attractive to investors, right? And at the same time, you're helping the environment. For instance, here we are going to do a sustainability linked bond, which is going to be triggered by carbon emissions. So think about a company that they want to finance an abatement program to reduce carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions. What you want to do is you want to finance those abatement efforts by financing, producing. So the company is going to emit or issue some of these bonds, right? And to make it attractive to the investors, right, they are going to add up what is called a step-up coupon, an extra coupon, only payable if the company does not abate. So you would say, how do you define that? I mean, basically, one way you can do it is if we go to Dan and the registry and tell them, I mean, you have the information about the carbon emissions of this company. They give us that data, we model those carbon emissions, and we said with a mathematical model, and this is an stochastic process in nature, and then using mathematics we can estimate the probability that in any given interval of time, those emissions are going to be either below or above a threshold, the one that we want, right? So you can estimate this using mathematics and data science, and I'm going to show you quickly how to do that without, I mean, I'm going to go really fast, right? For those coupons, we need to set appropriate emission for performance indicators, so we have the emissions that we want and the targets, and setting the appropriate value of the coupon itself, right? And the time horizon. So, and you do an analysis and all these things, you take hold of the data, and in a similar way, you come up with what we call a stochastic differential equation, right? Which in this case is called a geometric Brownian motion for the emissions, right? So mathematics, and then it has an associated partial differential equation, which is called the backward Kolmogorov equation, right? That's the one that appears here. You do some mathematics here and there, right? Change the variables, and then you end up with a probability, right? And that's what you want. I mean, basically, I don't know what happened with the font here, you come up with this. This is the probability, quantified, right? The probability that you are not going to, that 1 minus h that appears there is the probability that you are not going to stay below the target, the threshold of carbon emissions over an interval of time from little t to capital T. And once you have this, by financial theory, you can go and you can plug it into the value, the P. SL is the bond, the value of the bond, the sustainability linked bond. And then you can plug the number here. No, that was the level. And that's the value. That's the value. That's the price of this, right? And then, of course, I mean, you have some parameters that you need to, but I mean, the critical thing is that if we go to Dan, and Dan in his company gives us the correct data, we can calibrate those parameters, we can do all the mathematics, and then we can come up and tell the investors and the issuer of these bonds, this is how much you should charge for these bonds with the extra coupon, right? And then it incentivizes the company, because that's the key thing about this type of bond, right? You have a principal that is tied up to the credit risk of the company, but then you have this extra coupon bond, the step-up coupon, that is tied up to the performance, the environmental performance of this company. So they say, well, we better abate, because if we don't, we have to pay the coupon. And that's a very creative way to finance these abatement efforts, right? So like this, I mean, you have plenty of other things that you can do related to bonds, whether derivatives, anything, okay? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Enrique. I hope you didn't scare people. So we have some time for questions. And please, if you can identify yourself before asking the question, that we take for the records. So somebody want to ask a question? Yeah, right.
I wondered on climate risk thing, if you could talk about the distinction between physical and transition risk and how that seems to be, especially when you're talking about time horizon and stuff with things, a relevant consideration. I'm just curious for your thoughts on that. It seems like and with these rulemakings, it's an important part of how they're proposed.
Yeah, sure. So on transition risk, this is having the data available to look at what those risks are. There's a lot of different risks that can be assessed, right? And emissions are part of that. And some people go, what is emissions? How is that a risk? It's a risk in the sense that, if there are future regulations that relate to emissions, and those emissions are coming from an organization's carbon footprint, and they are required to comply with those regulations. If their emissions are high, or it's tied to fuels or emissions that are hard to mitigate, then that's going to be a challenge for them going forward to comply with that. There could be financial implications for that, or for compliance if they have to put in mitigation measures that are costly. This is the tie back to the financial performance that I think is concerning for a lot of organizations. So in terms of the transition, it's trying to kind of forecast what those areas of risk are and put a plan in place that shows that it's not going to be a surprise when it gets to that point. They can adequately address that when the time is right.
For transition risk has more to do with the economics than with finance, right? So here is the finance part of how do you finance the abatement of those things. Now the question is when to do that. That has to do with the transition risk, right, for a company. When should I do that? The good thing about all these things that we were presenting there is that there is one in the 8 that we listed there. It's called the real option analysis. You can do that mathematically and say, what is the optimal time for a company to take upon that particular project of abatement, and that takes into consideration some economic parameters and economy and stuff like that, and some models also. So yeah, this is, I mean, this deal is powerful enough to do both, to manage the climate risk and the transition risk. Yes.
Thank you. So Dominic Parker, University of Wisconsin. Thank you for the panel. Really interesting work that you're doing and discussed. I have a question, I guess, for Dan, but maybe others, about the accounting of net zero and carbon emissions. Is there any effort by your climate registry or others to account for spillover or leakage in that accounting? So for example, if the federal government requires a contractor be net zero, that means one of the contractors who wasn't net zero maybe gets a job somewhere else instead of the federal government. Or if a state California has a net zero requirement, some of the business that would have gone to California goes somewhere else. It emits carbon. Carbon's a global pollutant. Is there any effort that you know of in the accounting to try to account for sort of the global effects of a local policy?
No, but thanks for bringing that up. I mean, it's an important consideration. Where TCR is involved in that sort of analysis. These rules and regulations that I mentioned, they're in development and they are looking at some of the externalities that could be associated with going forward with those proposals. So they're all draft, right? And they get a lot of comment letters, groups that may have an eye for that particular challenge. But I think it's important because, getting to net zero, it requires a lot, on both the inset mitigation side, offsets, a whole package has to be put together in order to comply with that. Now, with the federal rule that I mentioned, that applies to major federal contractors. Significant is a lower tier. Significant, I believe, was between 5 and 50 million under contract, and major is 50 million plus. So the idea there is that it's being applied to larger companies that may have a greater capacity for absorbing some of those costs. It's certainly a question that comes up, and especially when you start looking at the state level, when these measures are put into place, because it could become more challenging to do this in whatever proposed work in certain jurisdictions. Others may have an advantage if they're not having the same requirements. So, and that may have some implications for the job market.
Another question? Well, sorry.
Oh, yeah, I have a question that's, I think Enrique, you've heard me ask this question before, it's a question that really focuses my attention the more I hear about this, but let's take it as an example, a critical piece of data about the climate, which is the equilibrium climate sensitivity that is aggregated in all the studies at the IPCC and the National Climate Assessment. This is sort of a moving target because every couple of years there's all these hundreds of new studies on this. And we're going to hear a little bit about this in the next panel, but one thing that and maybe this is a question out of lawyers' mathematical ignorance, but one of the things that I wonder is when you have a range, and this, take as an example that we're trying to set a carbon tax, and we're trying to set a carbon tax according to the social environmental cost of carbon. Well, one of the things that the scientists are trying to hone in on is how much do temperatures increase when you double atmospheric carbon dioxide? And all of their studies show a range from 1 degrees, which is not much, to 8 degrees, which is catastrophic, and there's a range of probabilities in between. And such a wide range of, then when you translate this into what is the value of what is the social cost of carbon, the environmental cost of carbon, you end up with a very wide range. And all of the proposals that I've seen for carbon tax recently don't even make an attempt to actually peg a carbon tax to the environmental cost of carbon. They're just trying to use it as a tool to limit emissions. And so if you plug this number according to such a wide range into the models that you're talking about, why would you get anything but a junk bond?
I mean, I will defer the answer to that question to Mike, because it has to do more with environmental data. I mean, on the environmental scientists to give us, I mean, I understand your question, right? I mean, I'm not an environmental scientist. I'm a mathematician with some knowledge of finance, so if you give me the data, but these things about the environmental scientists not being all on the same page, and someone is, I mean, that I cannot, maybe Mike can say more about.
Well, it's a probability problem, basically. We have to hone in on these things as well as we can. And your point is a good one, that the numbers change sometimes, but hopefully we're getting better and making the windows smaller and being able to quantify these things with more precision, basically, and have to be more meaningful. I feel like we're moving to that space.
It's a very complex system. I mean, this is very complex. I mean, and to model these things, and there are a lot of heavy science and using mathematics that they try to do these things. But lately, I mean, I'm a novice on these things. I have absolutely no deep knowledge of these things. But to give you an example, they are talking about something, so it's coming up. I mean, in a sense, the problem is so big, and we've been trying to tackle this problem for a short period of time that we still have to. But most of the scientists, they say that we have a problem, we need to do something. For instance, there was I recently read something about the ice sheets that they are, in the Arctic and the Antarctic, that they are decreasing, and they don't have a consensus of what effect that's going to have, but I mean, it makes sense, because when I read about it, it said that, if they disappear, it's going to warm the waters. How much? We don't know, because basically what those ice sheets, which are huge, they do is when the sun rays come to those, they get reflected, so they don't warm the waters. But if they disappear, that's going to contribute to. So, but there is a lot of science. I mean, I saw a paper from the 70s when environmental scientists with some knowledge of mathematics doing some heavy calculation, but still, I mean, I couldn't evaluate in a rank from 0 to 10, 10 being we know everything, 0 we know nothing, where we are. I don't know.
I have a follow-up, Matt.
Yeah. I actually was gonna partly, I teach environmental macroeconomics at CU. So partly an answer to the previous question is, I think in terms of the uncertainty in the social cost of carbon, climate sensitivity is maybe the 4th most important source of uncertainty after the discount rate, which is a normative parameter that we can't know, but if you change it a little bit, you can change the social cost of carbon by orders of magnitude. The emission scenario, assuming a nonlinear damage function, and then the damage function. We have huge uncertainty over all those things. And for that reason, some economists now argue that, because we have less uncertainty over the marginal cost of abatement, and so some economists argue that maybe the carbon tax should be about that, right? It's sort of, well, we don't, it's in fact impossible to know precisely what the social cost of carbon is because the discount rate is a normative parameter, but we have a more certainty, although still some uncertainty over the cost of abatement curve. And so if we have a particular emissions target, you can tune the carbon tax to get to that level of abatement. I'm not sure if that answers the question about junk bonds, but that's one of the debates going on right now in climate macro is like, should we even use the social cost of carbon as the benchmark for a carbon tax versus the cost of abatement curve?
Thank you. Well, also maybe so I will use my moderator rights to ask some questions to the panelists. So Mike, living in Miami Beach, I pay attention when somebody's talking about flooding, but I'm not ask you about that. It's just some technical issues. For example, What is your opinion on the use of big data and machine learning techniques in treatment the data? Is something that is there? Or?
Oh, yes, I mean, it seems very powerful, and we're starting to use it for looking at groundwater levels here, in particular the responses to rain events and how quickly the water comes up and then can create flooding because the water comes all the way to the surface, basically. So it seems like it's incredibly powerful from what I've seen so far, and our students are very successful applying these things. We've been also working on just looking at the water levels to try to look at like Virginia Key water levels basically as the main tide gauge we have here. And it's more difficult, if we feel like we haven't really identified the right input parameters, which is surprising. We've used quite a few of them, and all the ones that seem logical, and yet there's a lot of variability down there, which it's interesting.
Thank you. I have another question for Dan. It's what is your opinion about the Cape and trade system that is used in Europe for carbon emissions? I think it's can be applied to North America.
What was the
Cap and trade.
cap and trade?
Yeah.
Well, I'm from California, and we have a cap and trade program that has been operational. Well, it came under a law in 2008, I believe, AB 32, and it's really directed at the industrial sector and major polluters. There's a mandatory reporting requirement, and then there's a compliance requirement based on thresholds of how much emissions is being produced. I think it's at 10,000 for the reporting and 25,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide. So what we've seen come from that program since it's operated, it has brought in funding into the state for reinvestment into communities. So as California looks at, how they want to address climate, there is this connection between kind of carbon management at a large scale through cap and trade program and reinvestment to create climate resilience. So that's become a fund, and also not just resilience, but putting funding into programs that can to mitigate greenhouse gases in communities. So I know Europe has a cap and trade program. The details of that, how they're operating their mitigation side, I haven't followed very closely because I focus mostly on California. But what I have seen is that it has been a pretty effective tool for getting those funds to reinvest in the communities. Now it's not without controversy. Cap and trade has come under scrutiny because it does allow some organizations to that are emitting, to pay into the fund, but they paid the fund, and in theory it's supposed to go down, and it's supposed to become more difficult to comply with that. But some people would just prefer to not see those industries operate in the state or have reduced activity. So becomes a lot of questions about environmental justice, about having those facilities continue to operate. So, it's a market mechanism. It's been proposed. There are some benefits that come out of it, but also some questions from groups about that program. So, sure.
Thanks so much, Dan. So, Enrique, I have a final question for you. Financial environment is and interdisciplinary subject. So I want to hear you about your experience in communicating between people coming from different areas of science. This is a challenging issue, so as you can.
No, it's a challenging thing. Like I was saying in some of the slides, it's really environmental sciences and finance have been isolated. And then if you add the mathematics and the data science as the glue between them to create this new field of environmental finance. I mean, by nature, all of them have been separated. So this is something we are trying it here at FIU. I mean, we've been really lucky to have people like Mike, the people in the finance department, people in the College of Law, because there is also an environmental law component. It has to do with policies and regulations. And we are just starting this. Really, I mean, we started the certificate, the graduate certificate that we are offering now, that finally is in the books. We started in the fall of 2022. I mean, it's like very recent, and we have students here in the program that they are getting this interdisciplinary, coursework from all these things. So we still have a long way to go. I mean, I would like to work more closely with Mike and his team on the, on getting together and working on acquiring that data to be used in our models and things like that. But it is very promising. It is very promising. It's new but promising.
Thank you so much. We're just in time, so thanks to everybody for your participation, and you have further question, please reach the panelists and myself. Thank you so much.